function in a way isomorphic to the way the human brain functions, or sufficiently close to isomorphic, then it too would be conscious. But in the 1964 paper, I drew back from that view. Instead, I argued at the end that the question whether any automaton, no matter how it behaved, was conscious was not really a question of fact, but I said it depends on a decision on our part, a decision to, and as I put it, quotes, to treat robots as fellow members of our linguistic community, unquotes. But when I came to write the other two papers, two later papers, namely The Nature of Mental States and The Mental Life of Some Machines, these two papers I would describe as functionalist manifestos or computationalist manifestos. When I came to write those functionalist manifestos, I had changed my view. I decided that the question as to whether both questions, the question as to whether robots could be conscious and the question as to whether psychological states are really computational in nature, functional in that sense, to be factual questions. I had seen that the earlier talk contained an error. In the 1964 paper, I assumed that if an identity theory, a theory to the effect that psychological states are identical with brain states or with functional states were true, then it would have to be true by virtue of two things. One, the meanings of the psychological words, and two, empirical facts that do not themselves beg the question as to whether a robot could be conscious. But by 1967, I'd come to see that the same line of reasoning, if you'd applied it to the question whether light is electromagnetic radiation, or electromagnetic radiation of certain wavelengths, that you'd be forced to the conclusion that that too is not a question of fact, but called for a decision on our part, a decision to treat electromagnetic radiation as light. For, after all, persons who, knowing what we do about the causes and effects of electromagnetic radiation, if there were any such persons who insisted that light is not identical with electromagnetic radiation, but only correlated with the presence of such radiation, they wouldn't be contradicting themselves. That light is electromagnetic radiation does not follow analytically, as philosophers say, that is, by the very meaning of the words, from so-called non-question begging facts about electromagnetic radiation and about light. I now realize that it's wrong to insist that statements that make identifications, as a matter of scientific theory, call them theoretical identifications, of phenomena that we originally described in different vocabularies, have to follow analytically from, quotes, non-question begging facts in order to be true. If we want to claim that light is electromagnetic radiation, we need only maintain that it's rational to believe that it is, given what we now know. The question of analyticity is a red herring. Thus, I was led to drop my concern with analyticity entirely and to return to an earlier view of mine, namely that to return to the notion of theoretical identification and to a notion that I now introduce to go with the notion of theoretical identification, the notion of synthetic identity of properties. This is a little technical, but we need this in order because I will be dealing with modern materialist views of the mind-body relation, and these all need this sort of apparatus or related apparatus. I spoke of synthetic identity of properties because in the papers I published after the late 60s, I said that not only is light passing through an aperture the same event as electromagnetic radiation passing through the aperture, but that the property of being light is the very same property as the property of being electromagnetic radiation of such and such wavelengths. Okay. So there you have the schema. Here's light passing through an aperture A. So the first thing I say is There aren't two events there, the light passing through A and the electromagnetic radiation passing through A. They are one and the same event. The events are identical. Moreover, the property of being light, I say, is just the property of being electromagnetic radiation of certain wavelengths. So I insist to say that there's an event identity and a property identity, and that both identities are synthetic. That is contingent, empirical, not matters of conceptual analysis. In short, I held and still hold that properties can be contingently identical. And the way in which we establish that properties are contingently identical, synthetically identical, is by showing that identifying them simplifies our explanatory endeavors in certain familiar ways. Now, in my earliest paper on the issue of minds and machines, the theoretical identification that I predicted we might make in 200 years, I said, was an identification of human psychological states with the assumed corresponding brain states. At that point, I still thought it makes sense to speak of the brain state corresponding to a given psychological state. Also, I assumed in the paper that we might think of psychological states as more analogous to what I there called logical states of machines, states defined at the programming level, than to structural states of machines, states defined at the hardware level, thereby introducing functionalism as an option. As I said, I did not follow up the option at the time, but after 67, I took up the option with a vengeance and suggested that just as light, particularly in the paper called The Nature of Mental States, that just as light is empirically identical with electromagnetic radiation, so I proposed as a hypothesis, psychological states are empirically identical with functional states. Here is the hypothesis as I stated it in The Nature of Mental States. For the sake of simplicity, I stated it only for the case of pain, but I made clear that pain is only an example. Something like this was supposed to hold for psychological states in general. So, as we see, functionalism asserts that psychological properties and states are just a kind of property, or strictly speaking, a relation between an object and a time. But psychological properties, states, are empirically identical with functional states, as with computational states. And as stated in The Nature of Mental States, using pain as an example, that means, and I'll have to show you the next transparency because I can only fit the beginning on here. One, all organisms capable of feeling pain are probabilistic automata. This is a kind of computer or model, abstract computer, and we'll say a little more later about exactly what that is. For those of you who know what a Turing machine is, this is not the way a probabilistic automata is defined, but something equivalent to the notion. You get something equivalent to the notion of a probabilistic automata if you take a Turing machine and instead of assuming that the tape is potentially infinite, that is, that more tape can always be spliced on if it needs more memory, put a finite upper bound on the length of the tape.